I'm trying something new today. This is the first of a number of recordings that I'm going to prepare that I want to talk about things that were important in my life. And I know the quality of this recording isn't going to be that great. I'm working on improving some of my equipment, and I know that as I get better at using the software and the tools that I have, that these recordings are going to get better. My name is Steve Clark, and I wanted today to talk about how Brazil became a part of my life. Before 1995, I had, of course, heard of Brazil, and I had known people that had gone to Brazil or been to Brazil, and I even met some Brazilians when I was at the University of New Mexico studying my engineering degree. There weren't any Brazilian engineering students, but I really enjoyed the international club there at the University of New Mexico. And that's how I got to know people from all over, particularly South America. UNM had a very strong presence of going down there and getting students to come up and do exchange programs. But I'd never even considered going to Brazil. I had been working, when I got out of college, it was in 1983, I got out of college and went to work for Public Service Company of Colorado, working as a mechanical engineer in coal-fired power plants. And I was working in the power plants, and we made the power plants work, and that was what we did. But the utility industry changed a lot from 1983 until around 2000. And I saw things going in a direction I didn't like and realized I wanted to move from the utility business into something different. And so in 1995, I had the opportunity to go from Public Service Company to a company called TTCI. TTCI was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Association of American Railroads, the AAR, and did research, testing, and consulting work using the Transportation Technology Center located northeast of Pueblo. So that was a big change. I went from the electric power industry to the railroad industry. TTCI was consolidating, or the AAR, I should say, was consolidating a lot of their operations from Washington and Chicago to Pueblo, Colorado. And that included hiring an engineering economist. They needed somebody with a PE, and they wanted somebody with an MBA. And I had both of those. They hadn't expected to hire anybody local, but none of the engineering economists wanted to move from Washington to Pueblo, so that gave me an opportunity to do that. So I applied for the job and got it. Took a bit of a pay cut, not a whole lot, but it was a little bit. But it was an opportunity to move from something I didn't want to do to something that I was looking forward to doing. But it was a surprise to me on the first day at TTCI that I showed up and my new boss showed me to my desk, and there were a few pads of paper, a stapler, a couple of boxes of staples, some pens and pencils. I didn't have a computer yet. It was going to arrive in a few days. And he said, "Well, we're not exactly sure what we're going to do with you, but here you go. You're going to sit here, and when we get a computer for you, we'll start figuring out what we're going to do." And I was like, holy cow, I just left a career position at the utility to come over here, and they don't know what they're going to do with me. But it wasn't that bad. I found a book in a desk. I was rooting around looking for stuff, and I found a book, The Railroad, What It Is and What It Does. And so I spent the first few days reading it. Great book. And if anybody wants to know how railroads work, that's a good one to look at. And I also started walking around meeting people. In that walking around time, I found the marketing manager. I had no idea that marketing managers are always looking for people to help with proposals, and through the conversation, I agreed to help with proposals. So he snatched me up, and I spent the first months working on proposals. It really turned out to be a great thing because I learned about what the company did, how it was organized, and who the key players were. And as I was writing proposals, I started writing my capabilities into these. I saw where there was an opportunity to do engineering economics as part of the offering. It didn't need to be just technical. It could also be beneficial economically. And so time went on, and the next year, lo and behold, I became part of a team working on the Carajás Railway line between São Luís, Maranhão, Brazil, and Carajás, Pará, Brazil. This is a big, heavy haul mining railroad that is owned by, at the time, it was called Companhia Vale de Rio Doce. It's now called Vale, and you can actually buy stock in Vale, and I do own stock in Vale, and I encourage people to take a look at it. It might be a good part of your portfolio, but be that as it may, I began working on the railroad and had my first trip down to Brazil. Now, keep in mind, back in those days, it took around 32 hours to travel from my house in Pueblo to the hotel in San Luis. And that's if everything went well. No delays at the airport. And if not, it could be longer. And we sure as heck weren't flying business class. We were loaded up in the cheap seats, and it was quite a journey. But I was much younger then, and it was exciting and fun to do that. The work we did was to analyze the impacts of increasing axle loads on the Carajás mining railway. The other engineers did all the technical testing and analysis, and I did all the engineering economics to demonstrate to the client how it would save them money. Yeah, they might have to spend money to be able to make it happen, but they could save money in the long run. And it was a great project. It was a big project. That was back in 1996. I should mention that prior to the first trip, everybody got loaded up and went down to the local health department, and we each got about 10 vaccinations for every tropical disease one could imagine. I don't know if I really needed that, but it was probably a good thing to do. My first stop into Brazil after flying all night was in Belém, and it was an amazing place. The airport at that time was very primitive. There were really no indoor spaces, at least no indoor air-conditioned spaces. Everything was very open, very tropical, and it was amazing to me. The airplane landed, and you got on one of those stairs that rolled up to the airplane and got off it, and you just went. I mean, it was primitive. It was primitive. Concrete buildings, everything open, and the restaurants, the ticket areas, everything was kind of open. Now they've got a nicer airport that has indoor spaces that are air conditioned and all of that. But back then it was pretty primitive. I had studied Portuguese prior to this trip with tapes. Yeah, back then there weren't CDs, there were tapes. And I thought with all my Spanish, I would do pretty well. Well, boy, howdy, how wrong I was. We landed. I went to the restaurant there at the airport. The airplane stopped, and we were going to get on a different airplane to fly to San Luis. But went up to the airport restaurant to get some breakfast, and I asked the young woman there what time it was, and she understood me kind of. When she told me what time it was, I didn't understand a thing she said. I'd never really heard Portuguese spoken by a native Portuguese speaker. And it was a real surprise for me. And anyway, I struggled through, and I found out that it doesn't matter how much Spanish you speak. They don't speak Spanish in Brazil. They speak Portuguese. And it was during that trip that I kind of fell in love with Brazil a little bit, and decided that I wanted to learn Portuguese and make this a part of my business life. And so for the next 3 years, I studied every day. I got books, I got tapes. Even if it was only for 10 or 15 minutes, I studied every day. And as time went on, and I traveled more and more to Brazil for work, not only on the Carajás Railway, but then on the Vitória Minas Railway, another mining railroad that was owned by Vale. And I discovered what a wonderful but complex country that Brazil is. And along the way, I learned the language, and I got pretty good at it. I mean, in fact, it was about 2 years into my travels to Brazil that I had a very magical moment, and that's when somebody asked me a question in Portuguese, and I just answered. I didn't even have to think about what I said. It just came out, and it was the right thing to say, and that was magical. And at that point, I realized, yeah, I really am starting to learn the language. Those were the early days of my time there. We had a great time. We all worked really hard all day on the railway, and then we'd go back to the hotels, have big dinners. And in San Luis, the hotel was the Praia Mar. It wasn't that nice then, and it's probably not that nice now. It was very Brazilian, but it was right on the beach. And it had great food, and it was a fun place to stay. And on the weekends, we would have a great time at the pool. The air conditioners were old, and they worked, but it sounded like a B-52 bomber coming into land. But we were grateful for the air conditioning. We did not understand. I'm going to talk a little bit about the food. We did not understand, us gringos, young men. We had no idea that the entrees in Brazil were often made for 2 people. Had no idea. And after a day out on the railway, we were really hungry. So each of us ordered our own entree, and the waiters brought out these massive plates full of food. And we just thought we were getting a lot of food, but it was really enough for 2 people. But we ate almost all of it, each of us. You know, gosh, we were in our 30s, 20s and 30s, and young men who could really pack it in. And I'm sure the waiters were wondering, who are these people? How can they eat so much? But it was fun. The food was great, especially the fish dishes up in Maranhão. It's a wonderful place to eat. It was on that first trip down there that I passed through Rio on the way back. I'd never been to Rio, of course, and ended up staying at the Sofitel. It was a very nice hotel. I didn't know where to stay, but I was going to stay at the hotel, and so I went over to talk to the secretary, the marketing manager, and asked, where does Brito stay when he's down in Rio? And she said, well, he stays at the Sofitel, so she gave me that hotel. Remember, back then, we didn't have the internet yet, so you had to make reservations through a travel agency or do something. And so I made a reservation at the Sofitel. Well, Brito found out, and he was like, Steve, that's a really expensive place. And I said, well, Brito, that's where you stay. I asked, I forget her name now, but I asked her where you stayed, and she gave me this. And, oh, well, yeah, you're going to love that. It's a great hotel. So that's where I stayed. While I was there, I had a day in Rio, and I went to see Sugarloaf Mountain, Corcovado, which is Christ the Redeemer, the big cathedral. It was a wonderful day going around Rio. I took buses because I didn't have money to pay for a taxi. I was poor, and relatively speaking, and I couldn't pay for a taxi to haul me all over Brazil for a private tourist. So I rode buses and got the bus routes from the concierge there at the hotel, which he was kind of worried about me taking the buses, but I did okay. I found my way around. And then in 2006, I moved from TTCI to Arup. That's another story that I'll tell sometime. But one of the things that I brought with me to Arup was my work experience in Brazil, and we pursued work down there. And it was in 2009 that we won the work to be the independent engineer on a new metro line in Sao Paulo. And since I spoke Portuguese reasonably well, and I could certainly read Portuguese, I got the job to be the independent engineer. And it was great. It took me back to Sao Paulo at least twice a year for the next 10 years. And along the way, we pursued a lot of other work in Brazil, and we won work with the Rio Metro, the Salvador Metro, and some private financing companies doing independent engineer work or technical analysis for people that were wanting to do private investment in Brazil. And I was involved in almost all of that early Brazil work for Arup, and certainly all the railway work. And it took me to Brazil many times during the year, and often multiple times on the same project or every month or so down there. And so that's how Brazil came into my life. And of course, there's much more that I'd like to talk about, and I'll do that in another video, including talking about how I met Regina and how we ended up getting married. But for now, I hope you enjoyed hearing all this about how Brazil became a big part of my life. Thank you for listening.